Hey everybody, so this is Watch Dogs 2, and it's a AAA title that I liked, which makes it basically unique. Yeah, I don't like AAA titles. I sometimes play them obsessively, but I don't like them. They're just addictive. I like this one enough that I actually came back to it afterwards, and the reason is solely because of the characters. This game has characters that are generally good people, trying to do generally good things, and if I'm going to hang out with folks for 40 hours, they had better be folks I want to hang out with. That's the reason this game is better than GTA 5. I could make a video about the stories and the gameplay and the flaws and the strengths, but first off, that has already been written. There are at least 30 essays about this game, and its extraordinarily ill-fitting gameplay. But also, I don't think anybody played it. I think it was unpopular, so there's no reason for me to make a video about a story nobody's ever read, talking about the highs and lows of a story nobody cares about. Instead, we're going to talk about how to build your cities. Cities are the most expensive places to set your game. They are incredibly expensive, so it's important to understand how to build them if you plan to build them at all. A lot of people want to build their cities out of algorithms. They have, like, mathematical city builders. Remember that you cannot build a city better than you can do manually. You cannot magically algorithm up a city that is better than you could put together manually. So I would recommend putting it together manually. This is all only the case if your city is intended to be viewed from the ground, like this. If you're talking about, like, giant robots or orbital satellites or whatever, you go ahead and build your buildings algorithmically because your buildings are not the point. But in a game where the buildings are the point, where you're going to be up close and personal with them, you're going to want to know how to build them manually. And that's what we're going to look at today. How do you put together a city? How do you make your city feel good? And how do you do it on a budget? I'm not a super professional about this, so everything I'm going to say is grain of salt worthy, but let's talk about it, because this is a well understood situation. It's a well understood set of constraints, and most every city in this sort of game is built the same way. So let's talk about it. This game is particularly good, as an example, because it is cheaper than GTA 5, which means that there are plenty of major holes in how the city is built, and we can say, hey, look, this is exactly what I'm talking about, or that is exactly what I'm talking about. But despite those holes, it's something that you can buy. It's something that people accept as a solid city. So let's get to it. Number one tip, which you may have heard before if you've been watching my videos for a while: opaque windows. If you are building a city, your buildings will not have interiors. Only a couple of your buildings have interiors. Those are the hero buildings. You do not want the rest of your buildings to have interiors. So what you do is you just have this kind of shader that fakes a very generic interior depth. There's nothing actually in here. It's just a faked depth decal, basically. And that's something you're going to need to do because A, interiors are extremely expensive to make and to render, and B, you're going to be slapping your shit together pretty much randomly, and you don't want to have to worry about whether or not your interior is crisscrossed by random other crap. So, number one piece of advice: opaque windows. Other than that, a major piece of advice is not to worry too much about whether your modules properly fit together. If everything has a basically square footprint, it's going to be okay, because you can put together squares in a million different fundamental formations, and if the squares are different sizes or don't line up quite right, it's something the players will accept. They'll buy it. So, what are building modules? Well, a building module is usually going to be one floor of a building, sometimes less than one floor. So for example, this, and this, and this, and this, they're all the same module, and that, and that, and that, they're all the same module. Now, I don't know where the modules get cut apart. I don't know whether or not the full width is one module, or whether or not it's just a set of two that is a single module, and this is two sets of modules next to each other. I don't know that, and I can't know that without happening to see a gap between them. But I can tell you that each floor is at the very least its own module, and in this case it looks like each side of this might be its own module, because these don't look like they're set up quite right. They don't look like they're actually on the same floor. So my guess is that each facade of this building is a different module. So we'd have maybe 50 or 60 modules making up this building. And you might think that that's too many, but it's really not. These are static objects. They don't move around. They can be batched. And it's just super, super easy to set them up, use some vertex snapping, and then boop, 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 up it goes. No big deal. And that's the basic trick. Over here you can see a situation where they didn't quite snap it quite right. The vertex snapping didn't quite work out. See that? So you can see that what I'm saying is definitely the case. These modules are single floor modules at most. It might even be smaller than that. Sometimes a building's floor is made out of several different modules. So that is the basic trick. You're going to want to set up your building modules as single floor slap together add-ons, and then you can create virtually any building you want out of them. And even if they're square, you can do stuff like this. So this is a bunch of square modules, but because they're offset by 30 degrees, it doesn't look square. So over here, you can see this square module runs back that way, whereas this square module runs back that way. And now what they've done to make this possible is these modules have lips. These little yellow areas are lips, or white, I guess. But the black area, the roof, that is not actually part of the module. That is something they put in after the fact, because who knows? It might not be a roof that they need. It might be like a porch. And they need to avoid Z-fighting and all that sort of jazz. But here you can see this lip is very clearly just slapped in. This square module is obviously not aligned. It's not baked into this whole arc. This arc is manufactured by tilting square modules. And maybe this module is a facade. It might be that this is just a flat surface, but it could just as easily be a square building where 3/4 of the building are hidden. I couldn't tell you without more looking into it. Over here you can see some very obvious kind of slapdash configurations, but pretty sure I'm the only person that's ever noticed. So, you know, it's not a big deal. If you do something that's a little bit slapdash, here's another piece that's a little slapdash, nobody is going to notice as long as it's not in the player's face. Which really brings us to the heart of this entire situation. What is in the player's face? What does the player see? If we're on the ground level, then the whole point of these buildings is that the player sees them, and their eyes are drawn to certain ones and slide off of other ones. Fundamentally, when you're building a city, what you're doing is you're building a set of paths for the players to take, and I don't necessarily mean the streets. The streets are a really obvious way to put together the paths, but the buildings are what draw the player's eye. The buildings are what tell the player there's something worth looking at. So when the player sees something like this, they're going to be like, oh, that's interesting. What's over there? And they're going to find out, oh, you know what's over here? A ramp! Woohoo! And they're going to have fun with it, right? Because their eye was drawn to it. I don't want to get on the highway, though. So, back up. So when you understand that the whole point of a building in this sort of game is to either draw the player's attention or have the player's attention slide off or some other thing involving the player's attention, you can immediately start to plan your buildings with that understanding. You can start to think, well, what modules do I want to use here? I need some modules here that the player won't really notice. I need some modules here that the player will notice. I need some modules here that create depth, or some modules here that reduce depth. And once you have that sort of thing rolling, you can start to build your buildings pretty easily. With that in mind, I generally, conceptually, think of modules in 3 different pieces. I think of ground floor modules like this one, and then I think of mid-story modules like this one, and then I think of roof modules. Some roof modules, not all buildings need like a dedicated roof module. A lot of buildings just have a flat surface. But having dedicated roof modules allows you to use the roofs as punctuation points. And if you're doing any kind of climbing or Rooftop gameplay, you're going to need to pay even more attention to the roof, but in general, the reason I rate them like that is because that's how the player sees them. The low ground level elements are the ones the players are going to see up close, and those are the ones that have to do the most heavy lifting. They have to have the most detail. They have to either draw or avoid attention the most aggressively. The next up, the story elements, these are basically tone filler. They're there to create the body of the city. They're there to tell the player how bulky this area is, how rich it is, how poor it is, how overblown it is, how corporate. It sets the tone, it creates the mass of the city, but the player is never going to study it unless they're me. So you don't have to worry about the bulk of the buildings looking super, super perfect. You can get away with largely flat facades like they've done here. The roof elements are mostly for creating punctuation. You're not going to see very many roof elements in a skyscraper sort of area because you can't see the roofs, so there's no reason to waste time on them. But for shorter buildings, the shorter the building is, the more important the roof becomes. See this? So just keep in mind that you may need punctuation marks, and the roof is a very standard one. You can always use like really tall trees or something else that juts out above the building as a punctuation mark, but roofs are a good way to do it. Once you have that concept, that idea, those three pieces, you can arrange them in a million different ways. So in this case, what we see is we see a large number of square modules that have been arranged into this courtyard. Let's go ahead and walk on over there.
Get back on the road!
I didn't want to call it back. Oh well.
Hey, whoa! Take a look at yourself.
That was a pretty fun building, so let's go ahead and take a look at it a little bit closer. I am an expert driver. So what we have is a set of square modules that have been arranged into a courtyard. Notice that they haven't been created unsquare. They've just been placed unsquare. These are all square or rectangular modules that have simply been tilted. And that does mean that there is some strange places where the overlap is a little bit forced. See? Very, very forced there. There's also some gaps where they didn't quite seal the holes right, but nobody cares. It's fine. So what I strongly recommend is you do the same thing. Your buildings are going to be mostly square, and your building modules are going to be mostly square, and then you can place the actual buildings in such a way that that squareness isn't square. For example, you can always just have pieces jut out of the side, even if it makes no sense, because your windows end up merging into the wall. Now obviously that sets off my but that's something that nobody will notice. I didn't notice it until just now. So really, you have to understand square modules are your friend. You make the non-square buildings that you might need out of square modules. Let's go take a look at another non-square building, and we can also talk a little bit more about the ground level. We're going to spend the rest of this talking about the ground level after we talk a little bit more about fundamental square and unsquare buildings. Here we see another example of a building that is not very square. It's got rounded edges, it's got insets, but it's built out of square modules. If we take a look at these modules here, you can see that they are in fact the wrong height. They don't mesh in quite right. That's because this facade is just another square facade that is stapled between two other square facades at an angle. And then over here you can see how the inset is yet another set of facades. They didn't even bother to line up the brickwork. And that's fine, because you don't have to. As long as there's no obvious Z-fighting and it's not at ground level, the player is not going to notice. Look, over here you've got windows that are just truncated straight into another brick wall. The player is not going to notice. You can just do that stuff. And if you think it's lazy, well, try not being lazy. You will definitely run out of money and go broke. You have to build your buildings like this. Another thing worth considering is that your buildings are often not just a vertical element. Like this building has a base that is a specific building, and then it goes up and it turns into another building over here, but there's a tiered set over here with a third building, and then it goes up into towers on top of this. By creating multi-stepped buildings like this, you can create as much complexity as you want and end up with some really nice, beautiful designs. I love how this building looks, even though it's not a hero building. It's just some random building, but I like how the cutouts work. I like how it flows. I think it's a parking lot. So, by understanding your square elements and how to create non-square buildings out of those square elements, you'll have a lot more control over the result, over what your buildings actually end up looking like. And that's a really important thing to understand, because you usually don't want aggressively square buildings. It looks fake, or at the very least it looks uninteresting. With that said, let's talk about looking fake and uninteresting. Because your interest is in guiding the player's eye line, a lot of the times you're specifically going to be aiming for flat and uninteresting buildings. And that's where choosing your floor module comes into play. These floor modules are flat and uninteresting, and they're that way on purpose. You don't actually need to have more interesting ground floor modules. All you need to do is arrange them in a more interesting way by creating cutouts. Actually, that looks like it might be a criminal place. Let's go somewhere else. By creating insets and cutouts like this one, you can create much more interesting ground floor areas. In general, the players are going to gloss over anything that is a flat experience. Anything that's a flat surface is not going to draw their attention. Whether that means flat because it's all one texture, or whether that means flat as in literally flat, either one will make their eyes glance off of it. Like, these are buildings that the players literally can't notice. The building is so uninteresting at the ground floor that the player's eye just glazes over and they don't actually see it. So that is a core trick. But this exact same set of modules, this exact same set of storefronts, or non-storefronts, can be arranged in a much more complex way, lit up with some different lighting elements, maybe put a sign on the top that glows, and then you've got a hero shop. You've got a store that will draw the player's attention. It's not terribly complicated as long as you understand that you need to arrange the ground floor elements to be interesting on purpose. Now, a AAA title like this will create ground floor hero elements, like, say, that facade there. I believe that a lot of that is reused elements. Like, these pillars are pretty clearly reused pillars. But that is probably a unique green asset. I don't remember seeing that anywhere else. Over here, though, we've got the home electronics. This is a hero set, so it's got a lot of ground floor assets that are unique to it. But these ground floor assets, while they are unique to home, they are reused in millions of places within home. So again, it's not that you need to have unique assets. You're not a AAA dev. You're not going to be able to put together a million unique assets. It's all about arranging the assets to draw the player's eye. And the thing that draws the player's eye most is a break in monotony. So lighting the stairs, creating insets, breaking up the color flow. These are all things like that building over there draws my eye because it's lit. This building over here draws my eye because it's lit. Even in the day, that's when things that are inset and interesting become more interesting because the natural lighting hits them. Over here we've got a situation where we have this really, really cool overhang that'll draw our attention. I don't believe that this overhang has any purpose. I don't think this is a hero set. I think this is just a building that they put together. It's got like a collectible somewhere on it, but other than that, it's just a building. And it just uses repeated standard assets. This is the standard ground level floor that you can find anywhere. This is the standard fill floor that you can find anywhere. And then it gets cut off by a giant concrete slab, which goes up into more repeated square elements. See? Very basic. In this case, these concrete slabs are not built specifically for these buildings. They're not even concrete, they're rebar. But these slabs, which might be concrete, it might be rebar, they're just generic assets that get used. You can tell because, and they're used everywhere. Here's another one. So these concrete slabs are a way to shim any asset that doesn't quite fit. And in this case, the concrete slab hides the fact that the lip underneath this rounded tower is not actually deep enough to conceal right here. So if this concrete gap was missing, if this concrete slab was missing, there would be a huge gap in the mesh that we could just see straight up through. And that's why the concrete slab is there. If you look around in this city, you'll see there are concrete slabs shimming every third or fourth building. There's more right there.
Hey, fuck!
There's some right there. Some right there. So you're not building your building solely out of modular building assets. You're using a lot of shim assets and a lot of make-do assets just to try and create interesting shapes. You don't have to make sure that your interesting shapes are unique. You don't have to have unique assets for every interesting shape. All you have to do is arrange your square assets into fun patterns that draw the player's eye in the way you want the player's eye to be drawn. Now let's talk a little bit about the ground floor that is not the actual buildings, and that is something that gets overlooked a lot. A lot of people who are building cities, who are indie devs, they just slap buildings down and they end up with these dead-feeling cities, and that's because the life of a city actually is on the streets, not in the buildings. You need to make sure that your streets are lively. Although we've spent the last 10 minutes, 20 minutes, Jesus, talking about buildings, in truth, the most important thing for me is the rest. Everything that's not a building. You do need to have all these building assets. You do need to put them together. They do need to draw the eye or make the eye skate away. But they're not the most critical thing. And if they end up being a little wonky, nobody's going to notice because they're not looking at the individual buildings unless they've been told to. So in my eye, the most important thing is the trash layers. So when I say trash layers, what I'm talking about is the 3 core layers between you and a building. And since you're on the street most of the time, driving down the roads, the 3 core layers are parked cars, curb trash, and building edge trash, or whatever you want to call it, you know, the close-in trash here. These 3 pieces, none of them are good enough on their own. If it was just parked cars or just curbside stuff or just building side stuff, then it would feel very sparse, very Spartan, very flat and fake. But because all 3 of them work in tandem, they act to create a nice rolling set of things to break up the flow of the buildings. Moreover, we get used to seeing them. So as we're driving along, we know that as long as we can see curbside trash, there's nothing for us. Not while we're driving a bike. So we're not being interested in this building. These buildings kind of glide past because we know that there is trash between us and them, and that means there's nothing over there for us. As soon as the trash fades away, and there's something besides trash, we're like, oh, this is interesting. And we take a look. So it's the same basic concept as the buildings themselves. The whole point is to direct the player's attention. You put trash in to make their eyes gloss over, make them forget what they're looking at, and you take trash away when you want them to actually notice. Another trick here is that very few of these roads are flat. Now the reason for that is simple. Parallel lines will draw the player's attention in a very fakey way. The player will feel like it's very artificial if there's a lot of parallel lines. So if your streets generally slope up or down, not very much, just a little bit, then you get converging lines instead of parallel lines, and it feels much more natural, it feels much less forced. And the player's eyes won't say, oh, that looks fake. They'll instead say, oh, that looks unimportant. And again, you don't have to be very careful about it. This is not how ground floors generally look on buildings. This is not how they work. But nobody's paying attention because they've been told not to. This is a flat, repeated facade, so nobody actually will pay any attention to it. And so, that is the basic idea. You have to rely on where you're trying to make the player's eyes gloss over. Are you using a building element that's hard to pay attention to, like this just flat red and black forever? Are you going to be using trash? Are you going to be using lighting? How are you going to make the player not notice what you don't want them to notice? And how are you going to make the player notice the buildings you want them to notice? It's not even that you want them to notice the buildings. You want the buildings to guide their eye. And that might mean, for example, This building here, it will guide your eye. It's not a bit interesting building on its own, but when you look over at it, oh, hey, look, there's something cool. And that's what we're getting at here. The idea here is that when you're guiding the player's eye, it might not be coming to rest right where you've created the point of interest. It might be looking for a road or a light or whatever else happens to be there, but their eye will still be looking for interesting things. So you make things more interesting, more open, more inviting in the places you want them to notice. And we could go on pretty much forever. While you're probably going to have to build most of your building assets yourself, I own a tremendous number of Unity city asset packs, and I couldn't build even 1/4 of this city with them. But you don't have to build all of your trash assets. You don't need to build all your trees or trash cans or any of that stuff. Not unless you're using a very unusual visual that needs to have very unique meshes. You can just buy asset packs for that. So this stuff here, the tree, the trash can, the poles, the cables, even things like the steps, you can probably find those, but you probably will have to model the actual building assets. This is a AAA title, so they've modeled some building assets that are not that are one-offs like this. This is, I believe this is a single octagonal building asset. There aren't very many octagonal buildings in the area, and I wouldn't recommend that you try and put them together. It's possible that this is assembled out of a facade sandwiched together, but I don't think so, because there's no sign of a crack in the meshes, and this particular dev team is remarkably bad about hiding the cracks in their meshes. So I think that is a one-off, but you don't want to create those as an indie dev. As an indie dev, you're going to want to be careful to create facilities that you can reuse, modules you can reuse. Over here you can see, you can literally just slap these things together. You do not have to worry. Nobody will care that how these things overlap makes no sense, because you haven't told them to look. You haven't said, hey, look at this crack. Instead you said, hey, look, it's a Takiera store. Hey, look, it's a shop that you can buy clothes in, and you can actually buy clothes in here. So the fact that these modules don't perfectly line up, nobody's going to care. All you need to do is make sure that you've got a variety of them available and assemble them in any way you please. See? Here's another asset that doesn't really line up properly. Nobody cares. It's fine. So that is the main trick. The main trick here is nobody cares. Which sounds very silly, but that is the art of it. When you're putting together your own city, you are simply trying to make sure that the players only care about the things you want them to care about. The rest of the city is there for tone, it's there for body, it's there for flavor. It is not there to be actually paid close attention to and scrutinized. And if the player is scrutinizing a building and says, hey, you know, this building looks funny, this building is not quite right, this building that doesn't line up, that means that you accidentally drew their attention to that building. And that means that you didn't guide their eye well enough. It doesn't mean that the building is bad. It doesn't mean that you need to put it together better. It means that you have just drawn their eye at the wrong time in the wrong place, and you need to think about how to draw their eye correctly. At least, that's my take. Let me know how you think about building cities and the sorts of details that you like in your cities. Have a nice one.